5, 4, 3, 2. Well, welcome. This is the second tape in the Wisdom Literature of the Old Testament series. This is the only one of these lectures that will not be focused on a particular wisdom book. Because even though, as I said in the previous tape, that wisdom literature of the Bible is confined in those 5 books, Job, Ecclesiastes, Proverbs, Wisdom of Solomon, and Ben Sira, even though it's limited to those 5 books, scholars have often noticed that wisdom concerns and wisdom vocabulary do crop up in other parts of the Bible. Now, you got to be really careful here because some of these wisdom terms are just general terms that could be used in conversation, like the word wise or the word understanding or learn. Those words could be used in contexts that are not really wisdom at all. But having said that, I think it's still instructive for us on occasion to look at other parts of the Bible and see how they comment on and might give us insight into either wisdom issues or wisdom personalities. And as I did on the last tape, we have to start in the book of Genesis. I think the Garden of Eden story has a lot of wisdom language in it and some wisdom suggestions. The first one would have to do with what's called the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Now, a lot of times when people interpret the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, they see it as something that gives you moral instruction. That's where you hear the words good and evil. So when the first humans ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, all of a sudden they understood and got a sense of right and wrong. They felt shame at their disobedience and at their behavior. But there is, in fact, another, and I think a better way to understand the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The term good and evil used in this context, and there are, in fact, other places in the Bible that use it, this term can refer to the whole scope of human knowledge. So saying from good to evil is like we would say from A to Z, or we would say from coast to coast. So the tree of the knowledge of good and evil by this interpretation is not a tree that gives the first humans moral instruction. I think they had moral instruction. I think they knew the difference between obeying and disobeying. But rather that this tree gave people the entire scope of knowledge. In fact, that this tree gave the humans divine knowledge, the knowledge that the divine beings, Yahweh and the other divine beings, would have. So Yahweh commands the humans not to eat of this tree. You may freely eat from every tree in the garden, but from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat. So at the very beginning, one of the very first stories placed in the Hebrew Bible is a warning against gaining too much knowledge. They eat from the fruit, their eyes are opened, they realize they're naked, and then Yahweh looks down and sees what they've done, and he says, see, the humans have become like one of us. They know good and evil. And he drives them from the garden, lest they eat from the tree of life and live forever. The other way that the Garden of Eden story suggests wisdom themes, and I mentioned this at the beginning of the previous tape, is in the description of the serpent. The serpent was more crafty than any other wild animal that Yahweh God had made. And the word crafty, as we mentioned earlier, can be interpreted in a number of ways. But there's an interesting dynamic that takes place here. There's a disagreement of interpretation between Yahweh and the serpent as to what's going to happen regarding the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Yahweh says, on the day that you eat from this fruit, you will surely die. And the serpent says, you will not die. Yahweh never says what would happen, what the benefits of the fruit are, but the serpent says, God knows that when you eat from this fruit, your eyes will be opened and you'll be like God. So the serpent says they won't die. Yahweh says they will die. The serpent says they'll gain divine knowledge. Yahweh doesn't say anything about that at all. The serpent accuses Yahweh of denying access to the tree because Yahweh is jealously regarding his own powers and his own prerogatives. Yahweh says nothing about that. So the woman looks at the tree. She sees that it's beautiful. She knows that it's a good tree, good fruit to eat, and it's going to make her wise. She eats from it and she gives it to her husband Adam. Number one, they don't die. The serpent was right. Yahweh said they would die, and they didn't die. Number two, the serpent said their eyes would be open. And it says they eat the fruit, and their eyes are open. So the craftiness of the serpent makes the serpent correct in the disagreement that the serpent has with Yahweh. So even though the traditional Christian and Jewish interpretations of the Garden of Eden say that the humans disobeyed and that the humans were driven from the garden because of their disobedience, there is at least the bare suggestion that what we have here is human transformation from childhood and innocence and naivete to adulthood. They open their eyes and they see the world as it is. And that is wisdom. Okay. Another place where we have a suggestion of what might be going on in the wisdom tradition in ancient Israel is this fragment of a quote from Jeremiah. The entire context is not important for us, but you're welcome to look at it later. But he says, "For instruction shall not perish from the priest, nor counsel from the wise, nor the word from the prophet." And I suggest to you, that what we have here are three different identifiable offices within the court of ancient monarchic Israel. This is Israel when they had a king. And there's an office of a priest, and everybody knows about that. The priest is the functionary who works to oversee the sacrificial cult in the temple. The priest is the one who leads the people in worship and instructs them how they engage in the ritual slaughter of animals and how to observe the various holidays. The priest is the bearer of the religious tradition of Israel, the liturgical tradition of Israel, the tradition that tells the Israelites how they are to worship. That is an identifiable profession within the ancient Israelite community. Then we go down to the prophet. And the prophet also is an identifiable vocation within the Israelite community. There were individuals, some of whom were in the pay of the monarchy, some of whom were independent, but these were people who felt that Yahweh had set them apart to become Yahweh's mouthpiece or Yahweh's spokesperson. And these people would introduce their pronouncements with some kind of a formula, "Thus says Yahweh," or "Utterance of Yahweh," or "The word of Yahweh came unto me saying," and the words that followed afterwards were in fact understood and believed by the community to be words directly spoken from Yahweh himself. Now, the prophets were an identifiable profession, so much so that there were certain amateur prophets, Prophet Amos, for instance, that when people called him a prophet, he denied it strenuously and said, "I'm not a prophet, I am a farmer, and God just told me to speak this word." The fact that he distances himself proves that there is such a profession as prophecy. Then we get to this middle one, the wise. Why should we not also think that the wise, the sage, was in fact an identifiable profession in ancient Israel? I'm going to argue that it is. That there are people whose job was to be sages, to function as sages. And there are various figures within the Israelite stories that provide models for sages and how sages are to conduct themselves. This is one of the first and very interesting ones, the patriarch Joseph. I can't assume that all of you have taken Theology 205. So briefly, Joseph is one of the sons of Jacob, who is the patriarch of Israel. His name was changed to Israel. Joseph is his 11th, his second youngest son. And he was sold into slavery in Egypt, and he rose up through his skill, through his wisdom. He rose up in the ranks in the Pharaoh's service and becomes second in command to Pharaoh. This is a description of Joseph's responsibility. Now, therefore, let Pharaoh select a man who is discerning and wise, and set him over the land of Egypt. Since God has shown you all this, there is no one so discerning and wise as you. The first quote is from Joseph giving Pharaoh advice. The second quote is from Pharaoh saying, there's nobody as wise as you. And so he makes Joseph a counselor. He makes Joseph his chief advisor, the Arabic term vizier. He makes Joseph his second in command. Why? Because of Joseph's recognized wisdom. Here we see, and I'll be mentioning this also a little bit later, but here we see an indication of one of the functions of the sages within ancient Israel. They served as counselors to the king. They served as the king's advisors. They were those who advised the king on policy and on strategy. But the wise individual, the wise person within ancient Israel par excellence, the one that becomes the model for all the others, of course, is King Solomon. King Solomon was known for his great wisdom, and a lot of the stories concerning King Solomon do in fact speak of his wisdom. The first one, which happens shortly after he becomes king, he goes to a sacred Israelite shrine and he sleeps there. Now, many believe that when one sleeps in a shrine, one is expecting a divine visitation. One's expecting a prophetic dream of some sort. And that's exactly what happens. Yahweh appears to Solomon in a dream and asks Solomon what he wants. And this is what Solomon says. He says, "Give your servant, therefore, an understanding mind to govern your people, able to discern between good and evil. For who can govern this, your great people?" So the thing that Solomon asks of Yahweh at the outset of his reign as king, he asks Yahweh for wisdom. Yahweh is so impressed with this selfless request that he says to Solomon, "I'll give you wisdom, but you could have asked for fame, you could have asked for power, you could have asked for riches, but you asked for wisdom to govern this people. I'm going to give you those other things as well." And then there is, did I miss one here? There we go. There is the famous story of Solomon and the two mothers. The story is told that there were these two women who were prostitutes in Jerusalem, and they both had young children, and they each slept on the same bed. And during the night, one of the women rolled over on her son and smothered her son, and he died. And before the other woman woke up, she switched the sons, so the other woman was lying next to the dead baby. She wakes up, looks at the dead baby, and says, "This baby is not mine. The other one is." And the other woman, who really had the dead baby, she says, "No, this baby is mine." And they couldn't decide between the two of them. And they brought them before King Solomon. And how is he going to determine who is the liar? What he does is he instructs one of his soldiers to take the baby, cut it in half, and give half the baby to one of the mothers, half the baby to the other one of the mothers. And of course, the mother who had the dead baby said, "Sure, that's fine." And the other mother, whose living baby was being claimed, she says, "No, I'd rather that the other mother have the baby than that the baby be cut in half." And Solomon, in his wisdom, determined to test to figure out who was the true mother. And of course, he gave the baby back to his true mother. And this is the response. All Israel heard of the judgment that the king had rendered, and they stood in awe of the king, because they perceived that the wisdom of God was in him to execute justice. Keep in mind, wisdom has its practical application. Solomon's wisdom enabled him to make an adequate judgment between two people, one of whom was telling the truth and one of whom was lying. This is a more detailed description of Solomon's wisdom in 1 Kings. God gave Solomon very great wisdom, discernment, and breadth of understanding as vast as the sand on the seashore, so that Solomon's wisdom surpassed the wisdom of all the people of the East and all the wisdom of Egypt. He was wiser than anyone else, and his fame spread throughout all the surrounding nations. Notice a few things here. Notice that Solomon's wisdom is being compared to the wisdom of the East, and Solomon, probably Mesopotamia, and Solomon's wisdom is compared to the wisdom of Egypt. And it just so happens that we have ancient writings from both Egypt and Mesopotamia that belong within the wisdom corpus. They too are wisdom books. They have things in common with the wisdom books of the Bible. In some cases, it appears that the writers of the wisdom books of the Bible, the Israelite sages, actually had read these other books. So one of the things we notice is that the wisdom tradition is international. The wisdom tradition is not an exclusive Israelite tradition. The Exodus tradition, that's an exclusive Israelite tradition. But the wisdom tradition is international in scope. There are Egyptian sages, there are Babylonian sages, there are Edomite sages, there are sages in virtually every ancient Near Eastern culture. And Solomon is a part of that tradition, and of course this Israelite writer is saying Solomon is the greatest. It even describes Solomon's wisdom. It talks about him writing Proverbs, and Solomon becomes the putative author of the book of Proverbs. By putative, I mean he probably didn't write many of the things that are ascribed to him, but they're all thought of as coming from the wisdom of Solomon. It talks about lists that Solomon made, lists of animals in nature, lists of plants, because the sages were in fact the first scientists. And Solomon is the quintessential wisdom person. Now, the final reference to Solomon's wisdom has to do with the Queen of Sheba. We've already said that Solomon's wisdom spreads throughout all of the lands. And Sheba, apparently a North African country, although nobody is quite sure where to locate it geographically, the Queen of Sheba hears about Solomon's wisdom, and she has to see for herself. So she goes, she makes a pilgrimage from Sheba to Jerusalem to examine Solomon, to ask him questions, to see his court, and to evaluate whether his reputation is in fact true. And this is her final response. The report was true that I heard in my own land of your accomplishments and your wisdom. Your wisdom and prosperity far surpassed the report that I had heard. And she goes back from her visit with Solomon completely overwhelmed by Solomon's great wisdom and by Solomon's great wealth. And that's important as well, because there was believed by the sages, by some of the sages, that there was a relationship between wisdom and wealth. Remember, wisdom is learning how to gain mastery over life. So if you're a very wise person, it will stand to reason that you're somebody who's going to be very wealthy as well. So Sheba returned totally impressed, and by some traditions, she also returned impregnated by the great king in Jerusalem. Here's another picture of the Queen of Sheba presenting herself to King Solomon with all his gifts. There are other references to wise people within the Hebrew Bible. This is just one example that there appear to be people who were understood as wise, not so much that they understood that they had a quality of wisdom, but they were from the wise. They were people whose profession was to be a sage. And one of the most prominent ones in the histories is the wise woman of Tekoa. And it says in 2 Samuel 14:2, Joab sent to Tekoa and brought from there a wise woman. Joab is David's military commander, and Joab intends to persuade David to ease up on his punishment of his favorite son Absalom, who had murdered one of his half-brothers. That's all the context you probably need to know. But he needed to persuade David, who was angry, who was stubborn, who was adamant. And he figured the best person to do it would be somebody who was a wise person, somebody from among the sages who knew how to talk to a king, who knew how to be persuasive to a king. And one of the ways that the wise woman of Tekoa is persuasive to David is by speaking of his wisdom. And this is a quote from that woman later on in the chapter. But my Lord is her address to King David. She's calling him my Lord. But my Lord has wisdom like the wisdom of the angel of God to know all things that are on the earth. And she does. She deceives him. She persuades him to ease up on his son Absalom. And even after her identity is uncovered, she still is able to talk herself out of getting in trouble with David. David actually appreciates the advice that he gets from this wise woman. So finally, who are these sages? What was their function in society? I want to suggest that they had three different functions. First, they were diplomats. The sages were the ones who were open to contact with other cultures, with other nations, with other people. The sages were the ones who gained mastery of languages other than the one that was spoken in their own country. So they were the ideal people to be diplomats. Remember, the wisdom tradition is an international tradition. So the sages are the ones who move most easily between Israelite society and other foreign societies. So the sages functioned as the diplomats, as the foreign service, as the ambassadors, as the trade negotiators between Israel and the other countries. And who did they speak to in the other countries? They spoke to their fellow sages. They spoke to the Egyptian sages, who were the diplomats for the Egyptian pharaoh. They spoke to the Mesopotamian sages, who were the diplomats for the Assyrians and the Babylonians, and so on. They were also the teachers. As the court in Jerusalem and in the northern capitals in Samaria, as the court grew, as many people were needed in a palace bureaucracy in order to maintain the expanding country and even empires that begin to develop, well, they need a very large ruling class. They need to develop a bureaucracy. So one of the things they did was they developed, it appeared, occasions for teachers to instruct the young. Who were the young? The children of the counselors, the children of the ambassadors, the children of the princes. There were people who had to instruct them. There were people who had to give them the ability to read and write, because literacy was not widespread at this point. There were people who had to teach them about their history. There were people who had to teach them about reasoning and negotiation and proper comportment and etiquette. And the people who did those things on either semi-official or unofficial structures were the sages. The sages taught the children of the king. The sages taught the children of the high officers. The sages taught the children of the high palace officials. And these were in turn being trained to be the next generation of bureaucrats. The sages were the ones who maintained and codified the wisdom, the rules, and the regulations that they could pass on to others. Of course, there were other teachers in Israel. The priests also served a teaching function. And although the evidence is not obvious, I think there's a lot of implications that there was strong hostility between the priestly teachers and the sapiential or the sage teachers. finally, there was no separate group of people whose entire purpose for living was to examine the physical world and understand it. But the sages fulfilled that role as well. We mentioned that Solomon made lists of the phenomena of nature. And those lists, which we actually have some of those lists in non-Israelite wisdom literature, we have remnants or vestiges of those lists in some of the numerical proverbs. But for the most part, it was the sages, because they believed that God had embedded into the book of the world all the wisdom, all the divine wisdom that they needed. These were the people who had the greatest motivation to study the book of nature, to examine nature, and come to some understanding about it. So the sages functioned in ancient Israel. Besides writing the books of wisdom, they served in the society as diplomats, as teachers, and as scientists. Thank you.